This episode is sponsored by Well. IBD is every day. So shouldn't you have access to the nutrition support you need every day too? The folks over at Well couldn't agree more. Their team of IBD dietitians works with you to develop a care plan that is uniquely tailored to your specific lifestyle and provides the daily support you need in order to expand your diet, reduce your symptoms, and gain a better relationship with food. Head over to RomanWell.com to apply for a complimentary consultation and tell them that Robin and Alicia sent you.
Hi, I'm Alicia.
And I'm Robin, and you're listening to Bowel Moments,
the podcast sharing real talk about the realities of IBD. Served on the rocks. This week, we share a Crown Royal with Shawn Luna, and we talk to him about his diagnosis of ulcerative colitis and his symptoms of pain and fatigue and his eventual steroid dependence. We talk to him about deciding to get a new doctor and what it was like to make that choice. We talked to him about IBD in the Latino community. We talked to him about the mental aspects of inflammatory bowel disease. We talked to him about advocacy, and we talked to him about parenting. Cheers.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Bowel Moments. This is Robin.
Hey, guys. This is Alicia, and we are really excited to be joined by Shawn Luna. Shawn is another guest that we have been trying to schedule for a while, and our schedules never aligned. So we are particularly excited to have finally figured out a time that worked for all of us to talk, because you were on the short list of guests right from the beginning, just because I think you have a really interesting story to share with everybody. But before we ask you to tell us about yourself, we always start out with the really professional question of, what are you drinking?
Yeah, no, definitely. I am actually, and I might have started a few minutes early, so I gotta admit that. But I am drinking Crown Royal XO. I'm a
Nice.
Crown guy, so Crown Royal XO with a little bit of Coke in it. So that's my drink of choice.
You know, my grandpa, I think it was my grandpa that was like a Crown drinker. And I used to love the purple bags that the bottles would come in, and I would like store stuff in them, but I've never had it. So maybe someday I'll have to try it.
Like the different versions, they come with different bags.
Oh.
So the purple's the regular, and then they have a bunch of different variations that all come with different bags. So that's kind of cool.
Very fancy. I did not know that. I guess I've never looked in that section before. I don't drink a lot of whiskey, I guess.
You will need to try it.
I shall. Robin, what are you drinking tonight?
I am drinking something that I just threw together, and I have no idea if it has a name or not. So white rum, and I had some fresh fruit in the fridge that I needed to eat or get rid of. So I dumped a container of the rest of the watermelon with the watermelon juice and also pineapple.
Ooh.
And put a little splash of sparkling water.
That sounds really good. You know, what's funny is that I actually had a pineapple I needed to eat before I needed to throw it away. And so I'm having pineapple as well, but I'm having a pineapple margarita. Shawn, tell us your IBD story. What brings you into our community?
Yeah. So I was actually, I'm currently 43. I just turned 43 a few weeks ago. I was diagnosed later in life compared to others that, get it early on or in their teenage years. I was diagnosed, would have been 34, 35 years old. I had no idea what was wrong with me. I remember the weekend vividly. I was at an event for work in the morning, started feeling like I had an upset stomach, went home instead of going to the office after the event. And I felt like I had to, constantly rush to the bathroom. But what I started noticing as I was doing this was the toilet was full of blood. So I started freaking out, and I thought, oh, well, maybe I just, ate something bad at this breakfast thing. And I kind of put it as that, because I had never really had anything wrong with me. And then all of a sudden, after probably the 15th time of running to the bathroom in a couple hours, I started realizing this is probably something a little bit more serious. But I still thought, I'm going to sleep it off tonight. That was on a Friday. I was like, I'll sleep it off. I'll be good Saturday. And Saturday morning, same thing, all night Friday, Saturday, just run into the restroom and just nothing but blood. So at that point, I started kind of freaking out, thinking I'm dying. I started doing the Google MD, right? And I started looking up all the symptoms, and, everything was saying colon cancer and, all this stuff. And so the first thing I did was look for a gastro in my area that weekend. And I didn't even tell my wife what was going on, because I was already scared and I didn't want her to freak out. So she asked me, she's like, why do you keep running to the restroom? And I was like, I don't know. I think I just, have stomach flu or something. And so Monday morning, I went to gastro in my area. I actually called them, and as soon as they opened, I was literally waiting to call. And I explained to them what my symptoms were. And they said, can you be here in 15 minutes? And I was kind of relieved that they told me that, but at the same time, it kind of freaked me out a little bit more because I'm thinking, wow, if they're telling me to get here in 15 minutes, that's, something serious. So I get there. They basically told me that we had to do an emergency colonoscopy, and I had never had one in my life. So they scheduled it for, I believe it was Wednesday, one, because I had to prep the next day and then Wednesday. And I asked the doctor, I was like, could this be colon cancer? And he said, I'm gonna be honest with you, it could be, but we won't know until we see the results. And so automatically I was already that Monday and Tuesday, I was like, I'm dying, I have colon cancer. This is what it is. I believed that. And come Wednesday, we do the colonoscopy. I remember waking up kind of hazy, and I just remember the doctor saying, we have some good news and some bad news. And he's like, the good news is it's not colon cancer, but the bad news, it's ulcerative colitis. And I had no idea what it was. I had never heard of it or anything. And I was just relieved that it wasn't colon cancer. And I literally thought, because I've had never heard of it, never knew nothing about it, I literally thought I was going to take some pills and be cured, right? It was going to go away. And I left that colonoscopy thinking that. And he may have told me otherwise, he scheduled a follow-up and everything. But all I knew was I didn't have colon cancer, and this is going to be gone in a couple of weeks. And that obviously was the furthest from reality. So that's how I got into the world of ulcerative colitis.
I assume you've told your wife by this point, yes?
Yeah, so she was, when I came home Monday and they said I had to have the colonoscopy, that's when I told her. I said, hey, look, this is what's been going on. And of course, she got upset and was like, why didn't you tell me? And I said, I didn't want to freak you out. At the time, our little boy was only 2.5, maybe years old. And so I didn't want to worry her, we had enough going on. And so, when I told her, obviously, she took me to the colonoscopy, and she was there when I woke up, and the doctor told her the news as well. And like I said, we both kind of naively thought that, it was going to be gone in a few weeks.
I think that's really common for people to think that. I mean, I think that's typical. You get the stomach flu, you take a little something and you're done. So it's interesting because it reminds me of some of the other conversations we've had with people where getting that diagnosis is sometimes a relief or almost like happy news instead of bad news, because it's, it's not something else, or that you've been struggling to get a diagnosis for a while. It sounds like you were diagnosed really quickly, which that's such a, that's really fortunate, I think, in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I started thinking back, like when I got diagnosed, did I have other symptoms or other signs? And I honestly don't think I ever did. I mean, like I said, I hardly ever went to a doctor. I never really had any, besides the normal flu or something. And so I started self-analyzing, like, has this been like this for a while and I didn't realize it, or was it building up to it? I honestly can't say that it did. I literally think it, it was like a switch overnight. It just all of a sudden came.
Super fascinating. My dad had multiple sclerosis, and he wasn't diagnosed until he was almost 50. So I think he was 49 when he was diagnosed, which is, again, pretty uncommon. Like it's typical that people with autoimmune conditions tend to get diagnosed in their 20s or late teens. And, he didn't get diagnosed till really late, but my mom then could point back and find times when it made sense that that's what was going on, because it has the same sort of disease course where it waxes and wanes at times. But it's interesting that you didn't find anything in your past that really would indicate this would be a thing.
Yeah, it was, when they first told me, I asked, obviously, how did I get this? And, he started telling me nobody knows, there's no rhyme or reason to it. The only thing that they somewhat believe or know was that it possibly hereditary. And so obviously I started thinking down, with my parents, and, I don't remember my parents having anything like this. Later on, probably months or years, even after I was diagnosed, I started kind of remembering as a kid, I remember my dad did have some stomach issues, and I don't know if it was ulcerative colitis, but, that's kind of thing too. Like my dad was, one of those guys that his arm could be falling off and he's not going to the doctor, right? It's that whole, that whole machismo Latin, I don't need to go to a doctor. We can take care of it here at home. And so he may have very well had it and just dealt with it, which is crazy to think of, especially if, knowing how, when I was at my worst with it, how bad the symptoms were for half a year where I was in really bad shape, to imagine him just dealing with it, blows my mind, without medication, without,
Yeah, that is really remarkable. Yeah, scary. It's scary to think about, but I do understand that machismo sort of side of it. Yeah, my dad was definitely in that camp, and he was a Norwegian white guy. So the Norwegians are in the same camp with you.
Yeah.
I want to go back to your family in a minute, but you get diagnosed, you have a doctor. Luckily, you got in really quickly. Did you stay with that doctor?
Again, I knew, because it had to do with my stomach, that I should go see a gastro, right? But I didn't really understand that not all gastros know everything about gastro medicine, right? I just assumed if you're a gastro, you're going to be an expert in all of it.
Yeah.
And
makes
so,
sense.
I got set up with a doctor, really nice guy that lived close to my area. And he had really high ratings on, different websites and all that. And so that's why I had picked him. And I was with him for several years. And I had like ups and downs where I'd get a little bit better. And he was putting me on different medications over the course of several years. But the biggest thing was he had got me set up on prednisone steroids, which, was good and bad, right? It helped immediately, but then it started not working in the doses that I was taking. And again, I was naive to everything. I'm sure he did tell me, hey, there's going to be some side effects and stuff like that, but you're not hearing that. You're not thinking that. But at one point, I was up to 70 to 80 milligrams a day of prednisone for several months. And, I had to take that because I was in so much pain and none of the other medication I was taking was working. And so, obviously with prednisone, you have weight gain, you have, water retention, you have moon phase, and, your joints start hurting, like all this stuff, right? And I was actually on prednisone for probably about 6 years. I ended up being on for six and a half years.
Wow.
And yeah, and I just got off last year actually of prednisone.
Wow.
And so, like I said, when I was at my worst, when I was just rock bottom, it was 70 to 80 milligrams a day. And then I ended up going back to whether I kept the same doctor or not. He got to a point where he finally told me one day, I was seeing him every single month I would go see him. And I thought, okay, this is how this gets treated, right? And obviously over months and years, I started realizing, okay, this is not going away. I started to understand, okay, this is a lifelong disease and stuff like that. And he was putting me on different medications, and it was that whole step therapy, right? Where I tried the least potent, I guess, medication. And then if that doesn't work after several months, I go on to the next one and the next one. And I went through multiple medications. And finally, he told me one day at the visit, he was like, I don't think I can help you. He was like, I want to recommend you see a specialist. And I remember thinking, what does that mean? Like, you want me to go get like a second opinion from her and then come back to you? Like, I didn't understand. He was quote unquote firing me, right, as his patient. And so, he told me there's a doctor here in Houston. Her name's Dr. Bincy Abraham. She's a great doctor. She's the expert in this. And so there was a little bit of anger because I thought to myself, well, why didn't you have me go to her first? After, I've been with you for 2 years. I've been in pain. I've been miserable. I've had a horrible life. Why didn't I go there to begin with, right? And so that's when I started realizing that it matters what doctor you go to, right? Just because they're a gastro doesn't mean they specialize in ulcerative colitis or Crohn's. And so luckily I was able to make the switch to Dr. Abraham and get in pretty quickly to see her. And she completely changed my life. I mean, she got me on the right medications. Thankfully I'm in remission now, and I literally got my life back. It was bad for a while, but I got my life back. And as of right now, I'm in remission, hopefully stay in remission.
Congratulations for remission. I have a question about the steroids. So being on that high a dose of steroids over that long a time, you can develop steroid dependency. Has that been a problem for you? Are you able to get off of them and not have to go back just for that purpose, not for your IBD?
Yeah, so that's what ended up happening when I was trying to wean down. They told me you can't just stop. You got to wean down from this, right? You're going to have to go down 10 milligrams at a time. And so I started trying to go down, and there was a point where the main medication wasn't working. And so I could only go down to like 40 or 50, and I had to kind of stay there because I started noticing if I went any lower, I'd be in pain again and everything. And then it got to a point where I was afraid to continue weaning down because I thought, well, man, last time when I dropped down 10 milligrams, I was in pain. So I probably stayed on a certain dosage longer than I should have, but it was mainly out of fear, right? And I just thought, okay, well, I'm feeling okay right now. I don't want to rock the boat. And so when I got with Dr. Abraham, I think I was probably at like 30, maybe 35 milligrams a day. And she got me on different medications. And she told me, you're not gonna be able to stop this right away, but our goal is to get you off of it. And so I started weaning down again at 10 milligrams at a time. And then when I got to 10 milligrams, I got super excited and I thought, I'm about to be off of this. And I remember cutting the pill into half and going from 10 to 5. And when I went from 10 to 5, my body was like, nope, that's too big of a jump, And so from that point, I had to start going down 1 milligram at a time every like 3 to 4 months. And so, I got down to, I think it was like probably right when I got to 5 last year, I was taking it. And then finally one day I was like, you know what, I'm going to cold turkey it. I'm just going to stop at 5. I'm going to quit taking it and see what happens. And I quit. And it's been almost a year, probably, if not a year already, that I haven't taken prednisone. So that was a huge relief.
That's good.
Yeah.
We're big fans of Bincy on this show.
Yes, friend of the show,
Yes.
Bincy Abraham. I'm curious, did you talk to Dr. Abraham before you decided to go cold turkey, or was this a surprise for her too?
I think she knew that I was thinking of doing it. She knew that I was going down 1 milligram at a time, and she told me to go as I feel comfortable. And I didn't tell her right away, right off the bat, hey, I'm going to go ahead and stop at 5. But I felt like the other medication that I was on was working good enough to where, a lot of the symptoms that I had in the past, even when I was taking the prednisone, I still had symptoms. I wasn't in pain, but I still had symptoms, very clear symptoms of ulcerative colitis. And so that was another reason why I was like, I can't get off of this. But when I got to that point where I wasn't really experiencing the symptoms either, and my body was feeling comfortable, I just said, you know what, I'm going to risk it. I was at a point where I was so frustrated of all the medication I was taking, right? And that was just the main medication for the ulcerative colitis I was on. And then, just taking all these different pills and everything. I just started thinking, gosh, it's so frustrating to have to remember, when I wake up, I take this pill. When I go to lunch, I take this pill. When I go to bed, I got to take 2 of these pills. So it was just a relief. As of right now, honestly, I'm not on anything except for my Entyvio injection. That's all I'm taking, compared to when I was at my worst and I was taking probably like 10, 11 different medications. So it feels good to not be so dependent on so many medications.
Yeah, that really starts to take a toll on you, I think, especially when you're already frustrated by the disease. You're probably a little frustrated with the past care that you've gotten and how it may have contributed to the situation you're in at the moment as well. So that's really hard.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna back you up to your family, because I told you before we started recording that we really haven't had, I don't think, anybody else of a Latino descent. And so I am curious, and as two white women, we are not as versed in what does IBD mean in this particular community. So would you mind talking to us a little bit about when you were diagnosed, even looking back at your dad having these symptoms, what was your family's reaction to this? And was there ever any advice that you got, or things that maybe came into play that are specific to your community, you think?
Yeah, as far as my parents go, obviously they were very concerned when everything first happened, and, didn't really understand, what was going on. We're just as in the dark about it as I was. And they didn't really have a lot of advice in terms of like different things to do. It was more just, make sure you're following the doctor's orders, right? And that's funny because I think, especially earlier or younger in life with my parents, my parents were born here in the US, so they're not first generation Americans or anything like that, but they still had the roots from their grandparents of medicine that is not typical, right? US medicine, right? And not just medicine, but ways of taking care of things, right? There's all these old wives' tales of things that you're supposed to do in the Latin community, right? That, if you do this, if your baby's burping, you get a red piece of thread and put it on their head and it'll stop, right? Like stuff like that, right? And Vicks cures everything in a Mexican household, right? You're sick.
I'm so glad you said that. I was going to ask you about the Vicks thing.
Yes. You put Vicks on your feet before you go to bed and put your socks on, and then you put some Vicks on your chest and you wake up and everything's cured, right?
Yes,
and so,
I'm in.
Yeah. And so, all these different things that they believed work, and some of them, maybe they did have some kind of effect. But that's another thing I think with, especially in the Hispanic community, especially maybe first generation, or closer to being, new to the country or whatnot, they're really rooted in their ways of the medicine that they believe works. And some of them have not necessarily a fear, but a skepticism of what doctors are telling them, right? And, even though you got these doctors that went to medical school and all that stuff, you get a lot of, well, my mom used to do it this way. And, your grandmother did this and it worked. There were some certain things where it was like, well, I think if you do this, you'll, it should help. And, none of it wasn't in a bad way that they were trying to give information. It was just, sometimes it would get frustrating, and not just from the parents, but from other people that didn't really understand the disease and would try and recommend you do certain things. And they would say, if you do this, it'll take care of it, right? If you just eat better, right? Or just eat salads and you'll be fine. Not knowing that anytime I ate lettuce, I was in pain for a day because my intestines were just getting torn up with the lettuce. It was interesting to kind of hear some of the things that they would say, this will take care of it, and you'll be fine. But I think as time went on and they started to realize like, this is more serious than what we originally thought. Even myself realized this is a lot more serious. There's not a cure. And what's funny is my mom, for those in the community, we all know there's no cure. There's no cure for ulcerative colitis or Crohn's right now, right? But my mom, when I first got diagnosed and I told her, I said, I have this thing called ulcerative colitis. I remember she goes, I used to have that. I had that one time. And I was like, I don't think you had this, you might have had something else, but it wasn't this, but again, she didn't know. So there's a lot of, I guess, uneducation from a lot of people that aren't in the community. Had I not been diagnosed, I still wouldn't know anything about this. And what's interesting also about that is that, I had been with that original gastro for like 2.5, 3 years, somewhere around there. And I still, even in that amount of time, I still really didn't know a lot about this disease. What's really, really interesting was, and I think I might have met you this same day, Alicia, was I got invited to go to a symposium, education symposium from the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation. And I went, it was on a Saturday. And in that few hours, I learned more about this disease than I had known for the previous 2 years, which was mind blowing to me. Like so many things, like lights went off in my head as I was there listening to doctors talk, to other patients talk. And it was really, really, really interesting. And again, a little frustrating to know that I had kind of almost wasted 2.5 years without, knowing anything.
Yeah, I do think there is an issue with that. And I think in the entire kind of chronic disease community, there's, doctors don't get to spend any time with patients. And so you don't get that in-depth sit down with somebody who's going to say, okay, this is what your disease is, and this is where you find more information. And, here's what you really need to know. Here's your primer on ulcerative colitis. And then you can kind of go on your way. I mean, right away when you're diagnosed, that's not the right time to do it just because it's overwhelming. But later on, after you've had it for a little bit, you accept it, you go, okay, now let's talk about this. Let's make sure you have all the tools that you need to really understand it.
This episode is sponsored by Roman Well. Have you ever felt overwhelmed and unsure about what questions you should ask your doctor, or if you should get a referral to a dietitian? If so, you are not alone. The dietitians over at Roman Well help patients every day navigate these questions and many more. They've just released an amazing free resource for patients called the IBD Patient Starter Kit that is jam-packed with tips and tools to empower you to become your own best advocate. Check out the show notes or head on over to romanwell.com to download a copy of the IBD Patient Starter Kit today.
So speaking of frustration, obviously that is very common in our community. And one of the things you really wanted to make sure you noted is that emotional toll, the sort of emotional aspects of living with inflammatory bowel disease. So tell us why that's particularly important to you.
Yeah. And, it obviously is a disease that affects the person who has it, but it also affects the people around them, especially, when it comes to your family, your wife, your children. It was very difficult for me when I was at my worst with it because I literally felt useless in my own house. Yeah, I would go to work, and honestly, I don't even know how I made it to work when I look back today, but I would go to work, come home, and literally just like lay in bed or lay on the couch in pain. And really, I wasn't contributing anything to the house, and I mean, just regular duties that you would think, simple stuff like taking out the trash, stuff like that. It was just helping with the dishes, just laundry, anything. I didn't have the energy because I was so fatigued or I was just in pain. And then, especially when it came to my son, some of the worst, I guess, memories or moments was when it would come to the weekend and, I would be on the couch in the living room, like balled up in pain. And my wife would leave to go take my son to like the park or to go do something fun. And here I am stuck at home while he's, out doing stuff. And so emotionally, it took a really, really big toll on me. There was a point where it was a very dark place, and it was tough to navigate through. And I had a very supportive wife and family. But even when you have that support, it's still really tough if the person or the people that support you, they're not going through what you're going through, right? And as supportive as they can be, you still realize and know that they really don't understand. They really don't know the pain that you're in. They really don't understand. You look good on the outside, right? And it looks like, to some people, you might look like you're being lazy, right? Or you're not trying or you're giving up, but it's not that at all. Like literally your body is shut down and it's frustrating. And so that's one thing that for me was beneficial when I started meeting other individuals that either were affected from the disease, whether it was themselves or their family members, to be able to talk to somebody else that knows exactly what you're going through is very, very big. It's a huge help to just as a soundboard to get stuff off your chest. And again, not that your family or my family wasn't helpful or wasn't supportive. It's just, it was a different type of understanding when it's somebody that's been through it.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, it doesn't matter how well-meaning other people are or how empathetic they are. They don't know what it's like to be in the type of pain you're talking about. They don't know what it's like to have the symptoms. I mean, I speak from personal experience. We talk to lots of people all the time that tell their stories, and I haven't been through that. And so I can certainly try to be empathetic, but at the end of the day, yeah, I don't know what that's like. And so I get that you need the company of people. You need to hear other people's stories to be able to help normalize what's going on.
Yeah, definitely agree with that.
We could stay here and talk a little bit more about, in particular, being a man with inflammatory bowel disease, whether societal ideas of what men should be and inflammatory bowel disease have been anything you've had to cope with
bringing up the man role and all that, kind of just to segue from what I was saying about feeling like I was not even contributing at the house, that was big there because I would feel like I got to be stronger than this, right? I'm the husband, I'm the father, I'm the man, but I'm sitting on the couch in pain. I'm like curled up in pain, right? And so that was hard to accept. And that was part of the emotional struggle that I had, was I literally felt like I was worthless to my family, to my wife, my children. And so that was a very hard pill to swallow, and again, I would see my wife doing all the things that I would normally do around the house, right? That the man's supposed to do, quote unquote. And I would just feel worthless, and luckily, I have a very strong wife, very supportive, but it still took a toll on both of us emotionally, right? Because it's tough to have a relationship when you're not even there. I mean, I'm there physically, but mentally and emotionally, I was checked out, and I was just fighting to survive every day. And so it puts a strain on your relationships. It definitely does. And, there was, I'll be honest, there was a point where I was like, should I just get out of this marriage and let my wife have a life, right? Because I felt so guilty that she was having to deal with this, right? Like I said, our son was so young at the time, and that's a point in life where you should be out doing family trips, having fun, going out and doing stuff. And, I just felt like the biggest burden. And so, I would tell myself I'm being selfish by staying in this marriage and having my wife being drugged down is what I felt like. But, luckily my wife was, like I said, very supportive, and we fought through everything and got through it together. And, things are great now, but definitely I think in terms of the man aspect, it definitely puts a toll on you.
Shawn Luna, I did not expect to cry during this episode.
I'm sorry. Trust me. I cried many nights. Trust me. Many nights.
I could see your very strong wife, because I have met her and she's a very strong woman. I could see her shaking you at some point and being like, get up and like,
yeah.
we got to face this together, but it's together. And so I think, it's very, very difficult for men, I think, in particular, because society tells you that you have to be the provider and you have to be the strong one and that you can't show this weakness. And so it can feel like all of this is weakness when what's really happening is that you're just surviving in that moment, and that's right. You're not able to do anything. So that's incredibly difficult. So I appreciate you being that raw and open with us. I know that's not easy to talk about. So thank you.
Of course. I think it's important, that people do talk about that, because I'm not the only one that deals with that, right? I'm not the only one that it's happening to. And if others don't hear it coming from somebody else that's going through the same thing, other people might think, oh, this is only me. I'm the only one that this is happening to. I'm the only one who's at risk of losing their marriage or at, whatever. And once I started understanding the disease and I got into the advocacy, like you said, I really made it a point to be as open as possible about what I've gone through, what I deal with, because I really feel like the more people talk about it, the more normal it gets. Like before, when I first got diagnosed, nobody wants to talk about I have ulcerative colitis. When somebody said, well, what is that? So I go to the restroom every 5 minutes, right? Nobody wants to talk about that, right? And so I was kind of embarrassed at first. And then after a while, I was like, I don't care. I'll tell anybody what I have, and I'll explain the symptoms, and I'll explain what used to happen to me, because I think it normalizes it, and it makes people that are going through it feel like they're not alone.
Yeah. I mean, there's 3 million people probably and counting with this disease in the United States alone. Like, chances are somebody either has it or knows people who have it. So putting it out there is only going to help raise that awareness, which is a really necessary thing. Let's stay with advocacy then, since you brought it up. Talk to us about when you got involved with advocacy, what that's been like, and what's been most exciting about getting involved in legislative advocacy in particular.
Yeah. So like I mentioned, I had went to the symposium that the Crohn's and Colitis had put on, and I got kind of really intrigued about the volunteer work and kind of being a part of that. So I kind of started helping out with that. And then I was approached about joining the board and being on the board for the foundation here in Houston. And I was all for it. When I started to understand more about this disease and, really understand the hereditary aspects of it, the biggest thing that I started worrying about at that point was my children. And I had the biggest fear, my oldest son or my youngest son, we're going to eventually get diagnosed with it, right? And so right away, I was like, I want to do everything I can to, like I said, bring awareness to it and hopefully find a cure for it. So when I was approached about being on the board, I was all in. And so that was probably about, I think maybe 5 or 6 years ago that I got involved and joined the board. And we did some really fun stuff in terms of fundraisers and different ways to bring awareness and raise money to help find a cure. But for me, one of the most funnest things, and I think the most impactful, was when I did go to Washington, D.C. to Day on the Hill. And I got a chance to speak to some representatives and senators about my story and about things that we felt needed to be changed to help patients of ulcerative colitis and Crohn's, as well as, other diseases. When I went, we were specifically speaking about the step therapy with insurance companies and how they make patients go through multiple medications before they get to the right one, just to save some money, and how that can ruin people's lives when you're, waiting years to get to the right medication. And that was very interesting to me, to be able to go and actually see, things working and, the wheels in motion, and meeting different representatives and senators that were on board with us. And, they had their own personal connections. They had family members or friends that had Crohn's or ulcerative colitis. And so they were all for helping us to advocate for it. So that was really, really fun to do.
Robin and I are both really big fans of advocacy. So I love to talk about this. I think it's such a powerful way to get people involved with their disease and with their care, because it gives you the sense that you're doing something larger than yourself to help the community and even just yourself, frankly. Like research funding is going to help treatments and cures for your disease. And so it's just a really cool way to get involved. I got involved because of my dad's illness, it gave me something to do, because there's nothing else I could do for him. I can't treat him. I can't make him take his medicines, I can't live in his shoes. And so this is something I can do to show that I'm supporting him. And so I just think it's just such a cool thing to do. So I'm glad you got involved.
It personalizes the disease and chronic illness in general for our government. Like, you have to share your story with them so they understand what you're dealing with as a citizen and a voter. And it's just empowering for you to share your story. They want to hear it. Like, I know I've talked to so many people, they're like, it doesn't matter. What happens to me doesn't matter, but it really, really does. And and if you want to start small, you can send a letter or make a phone call or send an email. Like, the advocacy is something that you can do very quickly, very easily, and have a huge impact. And when you advocate for IBD, it has a positive effect on other chronic illnesses. Like, it's not just a positive effect for the IBD community. It helps all autoimmune diseases and most chronic illnesses.
Definitely.
The IBD research funding is kind of particular, but the rest of it for sure. Sorry, I'm teasing you, Robin.
You say that, but it's still the GI tract, and it's still what you eat, how you process food. It's still going to affect other disease states.
It's a very interesting thing to find out about the gut biome, right? How they discovered that there's so many other illnesses that track back to the gut. That's interesting and extremely cool that the foundation had a kind of a play in getting some of that stuff funded and researched, because it does come down to, what you put in your body. I truly believe that, like I said earlier, some people say, oh, eat better. When you're in the middle of it, there's no cure to do that, right? But like I said, I started thinking back, like, how did I get this? And I wouldn't be surprised if it does have something to do with just the way our food is made now, especially here in the United States compared to other countries. It's interesting how much things are banned in other countries, how many ingredients and processing that's banned in other countries, but that we have here. And I believe that does have something to do with some of these illnesses that we've started getting.
Yeah. And you're right. They found that the gut is the second brain, I think is what they call it, where it has a lot more involvement with the rest of our whole living and processes than people originally thought. So it's really fascinating stuff. When you were on the board, one of the things you had to do was bring in your employer to be a sponsor of something. So I'm curious how that conversation was. Like, how did you get the courage to talk to your employer about getting involved with the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation and talking to them about your disease?
Yeah, so luckily I work for a really cool company that it's a large bank. And so our regional leadership is very supportive of, not only doing things for the community and within the community, but also for employees as well. So, when we would have different things like a Top Golf tournament or winter gala, they were 100% on board with helping out. Funny enough, there was an employee that used to work with me that had come into my office one day and he saw a bag, my Ziploc bag full of medication. And he said, what's all that medication for? And I told him, oh man, I got this thing called ulcerative colitis. He goes, I have ulcerative colitis too. And it was the first person that I had ever met that had ulcerative colitis. And he's actually the one that told me, he's like, hey, you should come to one of our events with the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation. I was like, what is that? And so he's the one that got me into it. And he had already started the process of getting our bank involved. And then once he ended up moving to out of state. And so then once I got on the board, it kind of just snowballed from there, and they continued to allow us to do more and more events with the foundation. And what was really cool is my regional president here in Houston, he would always go to the galas, and obviously I would be there with my wife and he would be there with his wife, and we'd have other employees there or clients there. And one year in particular, he bought this customized painting that somebody was making there at the gala. I believe it was Marilyn Monroe. They were painting it while the gala was going on. And he put a bid on it and won it, and he dedicated it to me. So that was really cool to see that support from my employer, meant a lot. And, it creates loyalty, right? I'm very loyal to them. When I was at my worst with the disease, there was a lot of times where it was tough for me to go to work, and I'd go in late, I'd have to leave early sometimes. And my leadership at the time was extremely understanding of it and knew what I was going through. And they just, told me, take care of yourself, do what you have to do. And so it was really, really good feeling to know that my employer was 100% on board with backing me and making sure that I was good.
Yeah, that makes a huge difference to know that you're supported by your job in order to bring up the times when maybe you do need a hand and you do need a little bit more time at home or to adapt your workplace a little bit. So that's definitely key. Let's talk a little bit about parenting, because you are now father of 3 and quite spaced out as well. So you've had different relationships with all of these different little humans, one being a big human now. So how has it been parenting and talking about your disease with your 2 children that are cognizant enough to understand it? Obviously, your baby is a little too young for her to understand, but talk to me about, parenting your sons with IBD.
That's really interesting. So I have a 22-year-old son, a 10-year-old son, and a 6-month-old daughter. So every 10 years I have a child, but this is the last one for sure. My oldest son, by the time I was diagnosed, he would have probably been like 14, 15, right? He was already kind of aware of certain things. And, he actually lives in Austin. So he was with his mom and stepdad, but he would be over here every weekend. And so he knew what was going on and he was able to understand it more, right? Obviously than my youngest son, who was like 2 or 3 at the time. And with my oldest son, I told him what was wrong, but I didn't really talk a lot about it, especially when I was at my worst, because again, I didn't want to scare him, right? And I didn't want him to think that something, bad was going to happen or terrible was going to happen to me. And the dynamic that's really interesting is that with my youngest son, who obviously is living here with me and my wife, he grew up seeing me deal with this. And he grew up seeing me in pain, and he grew up seeing me on the couch, and he grew up seeing me cry, and one thing that I'll never forget was one time when I was laying on the couch and he was probably like 3, he came up and started rubbing my stomach and telling me everything's going to be okay, Daddy. Like I lost it at that point. Right. And that was actually one of the points where it kind of put me in an extra gear. I didn't feel like I was giving up, but I felt like, what, I have to push even harder, right? I have to do even more because I saw what he was starting to process and see. And so at that point, honestly, I started to kind of try and hide a lot of it from him too, because when he did that, all I thought was, oh my God, he's going to grow up just always seeing me in pain. And so I would hide a lot of my pain. I would hide it from him when he was much younger. And until recently, I didn't even know this, but my wife overheard my youngest son, this was probably last year, talking to somebody else, I think his cousin or something. And he brought up something about that I was going to die soon because I have cancer. And I never realized that he didn't really understand what I had and what was wrong with me. And that was my fault for just thinking, okay, if he's not seeing it and I'm not talking about it, he doesn't really know what's going on, right? But when my wife came to me and told me, she was like, you really need to have a conversation with him because he thinks that you have cancer and that you're going to die soon. And so, that broke my heart to know that for I don't know how many years he's thought that I was on death's bed. And so, I sat down with him and just had a, grown up conversation, I guess, about, what it is I have. And, hey, look, I'm not dying. I'm not going to die. This isn't something that's going to make me die, but this is something that I had to deal with. And it was very difficult, but now I'm 100% better. And I just had to let him know, this is what I went through. But luckily I let him know with his help and with his support, I was able to get through everything. So it was very eye-opening, like I said, to really sit back and think, like they say, kids are sponges. They pick up everything. They see everything, even though they're not, you don't think they're listening, you don't think they're watching, they are, and so, I guess as one piece of advice, there's somebody out there that does have a young child and they're dealing with this right now. You got to be careful of what they're hearing and what they're believing, because they could go months or years with thinking something's worse than it really is.
Yeah, when we had my daughters on to talk to them about like growing up with me when they were younger, it's a fine line that you walk, because like I talk about having had an ostomy when they were that age, 3 years old, and not wanting them to be scared of it because I might have had to have it forever, but also, understanding that it's going to make me different. Like it is something that is forever, right? So you try to balance with sharing with them how they can understand on their level, but then you don't know what they're going to take away from that. Like your son thinking that it was worse than ulcerative colitis. So it's hard to talk to your kids about it because you want them to know and understand, but you also don't want them to be scared, but you also don't want them to go talk to their cousin and tell them that you're dying.
Exactly. And at the same time, you don't know what age, really, like what age can I tell them this, that they're going to really understand it and retain it, especially when they're that young, 5, 6 years old, months. It's like, okay, do I tell him at 5? Do I tell him at 7? When do I tell him? And that he's going to remember it and he's going to understand really what it is.
Yeah.
Right. And I think my problem was that, I kept putting it off and just thinking he knew, right. And thinking he understood. And obviously he didn't.
Well, even for older kids, I mean, my dad was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis when I was 16. And my parents both were like, if you don't say anything, it doesn't exist. And so I knew my dad was really, really ill. I mean, like he was hospitalized, like it was kind of similar where it's like all of a sudden he's home and he's very sick and I can see it, but nobody told me what it was. And like nobody explained anything to me. And so I did exactly what your small son did and was like, well, I guess he's dying. And nobody corrected me. So it was like, it took me going out and doing research on my own, which at the time, the internet, I don't think existed, and so I had to like go find a book and look it up. And so it's exactly what you said. And I'm going to pull a Robin here and say, I think it's really important. So I'm going to say it again, that your kids are aware of what's happening, even if you are trying to hide it, because kids are sponges, they're picking it up. So you have to figure out how to explain it. Even if it's as a 3-year-old, you say, well, daddy has a disease in his tummy and I don't feel very good right now. And I'll get better, but I'm sick right now. But I really appreciate you coming and patting my tummy and giving me hugs, and like, that's really helpful to me. And then when he gets to be 5, say, okay, disease in your tummy turns into maybe a little more information. But that's really hard when there's no answers either. I mean, there's no cure. You don't know if your treatment's going to work forever. Like it's hard to say that to kids.
Yeah. And in regards to the sponge piece, it's also like selective hearing, right? Like I think the reason he associated what I had with cancer is because I believe he probably heard me telling people about when I thought I had colon cancer and all he registered was I have colon cancer. Right. And so that's important too, is like I said, they hear so much, right? But they retain certain parts of it. Right. So you want to make sure they retain what's correct. So
also I have to call you out, Alicia. The internet was not around when you were 16 years old. So don't even try. Actually, don't even try to pretend like it might have been.
It did. It just was not accessible in anyone's homes at all. It was like for government use only, I'm sure.
Right.
And it wasn't called the internet. It was the World Wide Web.
Right.
Exactly. I had to go to a library and I had to use a card catalog. That's how that worked. So it was dinosaurs. There was dinosaurs roaming the earth. It felt like. Well, Shawn, we are running out of time. So we're going to ask you the final question. You already gave us a really good piece of advice, but if you have another piece of advice to share with our IBD community, what would it be?
I got to reiterate the part about I'm on different boards online, like on Facebook groups and stuff like that for people that have Crohn's and colitis. And so I've met random individuals through these, that live in other parts of the country. And I've had conversations with them and I always direct them to different resources. And the number one thing that I always tell everybody is, especially if they're saying that they've, been dealing with this disease and it doesn't seem like you're getting any kind of relief or that anything's working, the number one thing I always tell people is don't be afraid to ask questions to your doctor and don't be afraid to change doctors, right? Like, I thought that it was going to be something bad or it was rude to tell the doctor like, hey, I want to go see somebody else, right? I want to get a second opinion. And so that's the number one thing I tell people is look for a gastroenterologist that specializes in what you have, because I forget who it was, but somebody told me, when I had mentioned, this doctor wants me to see somebody else and I didn't understand why, they told me that particular doctor might only have 2 or 3% of his patients that have Crohn's and ulcerative colitis. So it doesn't make sense for him to invest the time to research and to follow what's going on with that when he has 95% of his patients that are dealing with other stuff. And, that's what kind of put the light bulb off in my head that, that makes a lot of sense. You want to be with a doctor that specializes in your issue and is getting as much research as they can to find the right type of medicine and the right variations of medications to help your situations. That's something that I always tell everybody that deals with it and that's not in remission or that's having difficulty getting a remission is don't be afraid to research other doctors.
Yes, that is definitely something that Robin and I talk about on the show pretty regularly is, don't be afraid to get a second opinion and you're not going to offend anybody. And you don't actually even have to tell your doctor you're getting a second opinion. They don't need to know if you're uncomfortable doing it. If you're non-confrontational, you don't have to even tell them.
The other thing, and this is something that I used to talk about before too, was, and I heard somebody talk about this at symposium and it always stuck with me, was your baseline, right? Of how you feel, right? Like when you're 100%, your baseline's at the top, right? And then when you start getting really, really bad with your pain and everything, and let's say your baseline gets down to 20%, right? Like you're at 20%. When you get up to 50, you feel great and you think, okay, I'm good, I'm healthy, I'm cured, because you spent so much time at 20% that 50% feels amazing, right? And I remember being at 50% and thinking, okay, I'm done. I beat this, right? Or I'm in remission. And I really wasn't, right? But I wasn't in as much pain as I was the months prior. And so don't fall into that false sense of everything's fine now, I can stop doing what I was doing or whatever. And you know, I know I said I stopped the prednisone, but trust me, I was I was much closer to the 100% threshold when I did that. You know, don't get fooled into thinking 50% baseline is 100%. I think that's really important too, because I think a lot of people, you know, they'll be at 50%, they'll drop back down to 30 and they think, oh my God, the world just fell apart. I was good and now I'm back to being bad. Reality, you weren't that great, right? It was just you were a little bit better than you were before.
I love the way that you explained that. It resonated so much with me. And earlier in the conversation, you said something that made me think of like the joke where the doctor says, you know, what's your pain scale today? And you say, oh, it's just the normal amount of pain. And the doctor says the normal amount of pain is 0, right? But for so many of us, the normal amount of pain is not 0, right? You live at a 3. For so many years, I lived at a 3, and that was my baseline. And now, since I've had the surgeries, I'm waiting for the pain to come, but it's not there. And I'm like, oh, there's no pain. Like this really is a 0. This is this is really the normal amount of pain is 0. And it's like surprising to me every day. I can't wait for that to be my norm. But people need to understand just what you said. Like you can't normalize being 20% and then feel like 50 is 100. That really spoke to me today. Thank you, Shawn.
No, of course. I think it's important. I definitely think it's important.
There was a pediatric therapist that I think Robin and I both know. And it was interesting because one of her jobs when she worked in a children's hospital with kids with inflammatory bowel disease is she would sit down with a like pain chart, you know, how they've got the smiley face all the way down to the like, you know, the sad crying face. And she would have the kids tell her, what does that mean to them? So what is the smiley face or like the no pain? What does that look like to you? Like describe that. And she would write that down because for every kid, it was a little bit different. And so when they're going in, when the doctor is asking you, like, what is your 0, their version of 0 might be very different than yours. 0. Like that just reminded me when you were saying that, Robin, of like 0 is no pain, but for you, it is some pain, you know? And so perhaps sitting down and almost being like a pediatric kid and writing down, like, this is my scale and giving it to your doctor so that when you come in and say, I'm at a 3 for you is not sleeping for a couple of hours every night because the pain is bad. But for me, a 3 is like, okay, I had a mild headache yesterday, you know, kind of thing. So, you know, maybe giving that information to your doctor is a nice way also of helping manage that scale so that the doctor can say, hey, I actually think you're maybe more at a 50. Like, I know we can do better. So, I thought that was a really
totally agree
thing. I hadn't thought about doing that, but it makes sense because everybody is different and they manage pain differently. They manage symptoms differently. So such great advice. Thank you. Shawn, this was really fun to talk to you. Thank you so much for being our guest on Bowel Moments.
Definitely.
So thank you so much to you. Thank you so much for our audience. And sadly, you're out of drink, but cheers anyway.
Cheers. Yep.
Cheers to you guys as well. Thank you. I really enjoyed this. Hey, everybody, this is Shawn. If you enjoyed the show, please rate, review, subscribe, and share this with your friends.